Welcome to Family Basics 101. I'm Dr. Bruce McClure, and as we begin our 5-part series this week entitled Crises Management, we will look at 5 components of crises. The first day today, we will talk about just a simple definition of what is a crisis. Next, we will look at the myths about crises. Third, we will look at the source of crises. And fourth, we will look at the stages of a crisis. And then finally, we will discuss how do you help people navigate the major crises of their lives. So let's begin by defining a crisis. According to Dr. H. Norman Wright, in order to assist families, individuals, or institutions, we must first make sure that we define a crisis correctly. So what Dr. H. Norman Wright argues is if a proper navigation through a crisis is to take place, then those who are helping with the crises, as well as an individual who is engaged in the crises, must have a proper working definition that is clear in the mind of both the helper and the individual who is in need of help. If a clear understanding of what is or what is not a crisis, helpers might find themselves trying to move people away from not a crisis, but rather an internal struggle that is simply a part of daily life rather than a world-shaking emotional challenge. So in essence, the summary is this. If there's not a clear understanding of a crisis, then every event in an individual's life will necessitate a response from a helper as if it is a crisis, when in fact it might be just a regular routine situation that for the most part life presents. A crisis, by definition, is an event that overwhelms or immobilizes a person. A crisis, by definition, is an event in which a person has failed to properly resolve a problem within themselves that is triggered by some external force outside themselves. A crisis sometimes hits without warning, and yet sometimes it can be anticipated. A crisis must be a threat to a person's security. So when we look at the components of a crisis, by definition, it overwhelms and it immobilizes. By definition, it's not handled correctly, resolution is not handled correctly, then it will cause the person to become stuck wherever they find themselves in that moment of whatever that crisis is. And many times crises hit without warning. Many times crises are anticipated. And in order for it to really become a crisis or to be a crisis, the security of a person, their life must be threatened, their well-being must be threatened. And if that is not the criteria by which a crisis is defined, then many times we are mistakenly labeling what is really a loss as a crisis. Do not mistake one for the other. A loss is anything that impacts one's ideas based upon prior beliefs or emotions. A loss is anything that hurts one's homeostasis. Now, what is the homeostasis? It's that which is the property of a system that regulates its internal environment by attempting to maintain the stable known of what is learned. So we look at the homeostasis, and whenever a person is sensing a loss, not a crisis, there's the threat of the homeostasis of the individual being disrupted. It's those things that are learned, those familiar acts, the thoughts, and the attitudes. Loss may vary from person to person. Therefore, the meaning of loss might vary from person to person. When individuals have not learned the difference between a crisis and a loss, every loss becomes a crisis. In the New Testament, there is a lengthy story in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, beginning at verse number 38. People in pain can create a crisis out of the context of their pain. Look at the story beginning at verse number 38 of Luke chapter 10. Now it came to pass as they went that he entered into a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha received him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, which also sat at the feet of Jesus and heard his word. But Martha was cumbered. That term cumbered means she was mentally distracted. She was mentally distracted, focused on much serving. And she comes to Jesus and said, Lord, dost thou not care that my sister have left me to serve alone? Bid her therefore that she come and help me. And Jesus answered and said unto her, Martha, Martha, thou art careful. That term careful means, Martha, you are anxious and you are troubled. The word trouble comes from a word turbulence. You are already in an uproar. There's a breach that is already in existence inside of you, and it's not about one thing. You are breached. You are anxious about many things. But one thing is needful, and Mary hath chosen that good part, which shall not be taken away from her. Many times when people communicate a crisis, it's not very easy to recognize with the naked eye that it's not a crisis, but they are struggling with some type internal disruption of their homeostasis. Jesus, as the master healer, was able to look beyond the cry of Martha and address the internal disruption that was already in existence inside of her. He says to her, you are mentally distracted. Can you imagine that type of analysis? And yet she comes and say, we've got a major situation with my sister. Jesus says, no, the situation is not with your sister. The situation rests within you. It's you that are mentally distracted. And he said again to her, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and you have a turbulence. You are in an uproar about many things. And when you look at the contextual setting in which Jesus is saying this, he in essence is saying, this existed before I came into your home, and this existed before your sister sat at my feet. This was already inside of you, and now you are saying, if your sister came out to help you serve, then you would be at peace. And Jesus' response is simple. The reality is, that's not going to put you at peace. I'll see you back in class again tomorrow. Don't be late, and don't skip class.